So, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. So nice to see you here on this Tuesday evening. My name is Lizzie Shea, and I'm the director of Judiskultur i Sverige, Jewish culture in Sweden. And I want to welcome you to Konstakademin and to this special evening, Meet the Writer with Nicole Krauss. We're extremely happy to have her here. We have been trying for a few years. We've had contact with her. We met her last time that she was here, and she's finally here. All of Nicole Krauss' 4 books were translated into Swedish. We are here because her latest, Dunkel Skog, came out and will be here outside for sale. Nicole will be signing her book as well as the history of love. So all of them with Bromberg Bokförlag, and we are doing this evening in cooperation with Bromberg Bokförlag and Konstakademin. So I hope that you have a good evening. Nicole will be speaking with Madeleine Levy, who is an editor and literature journalist at Svenska Dagbladet, among others. Nicole Krauss and I have at least 2 things in common. We are both good friends of Edgar Keret, and both of us were good friends of Yoram Kaniuk. So one thing that puts us together. But I'm very thrilled, ladies and gentlemen, to have Meet the Writer program this evening with Nicole Krauss and Madeleine Levy. Welcome them.
So, are we turned on? Yeah?
Yes,
Hear
we
us
are.
properly? Thank you. Hello.
Hello.
So, I must admit, when you do these kinds of conversations, you do some reading, some thinking, you end up with a list of themes, things you want to talk about. This time round, the list of themes was about 3 pages long, and we are not going to be here for 10 hours. So I've tried to cull, but I think it says something about the, well, richness and amount of ideas and the depth of ideas perhaps presented in, well, in Forest Dark, your latest books, which we are going to talk about mostly this evening, but also about you as an author. There's a lot of thought going around. This also meant that I found it a little bit difficult to sum up what we're going to talk about. But I did write something like this. Forest Dark is a novel about 2 people looking for freedom, but not quite knowing what that is. Sounds about right?
Let's expand on it.
Yeah, let's expand.
It's terrible to have to be concise about something that took you every word that's in there to actually write. So I hate to have to summarize, but maybe we can expand from that.
Yes. Let's begin perhaps where, well, the novel begins, with Epstein, Jules Epstein, formidable man. He is larger than life, so much so that even disappearing, he can't die just like quietly like anyone else. His aspirations are called gargantuan. He has got an enormous, well, lust for life, appetite for life. How did this man come to you? Why did you want to write about a man, at least whose past has been like this?
Yeah. Well, he is part of 2 sides, a sort of parallel stories that Forest Dark is broken into. That are, I always think of them as 2 sides of one coin. So even though both of these stories, Epstein's and then we'll talk about Nicole's later, never touch each other physically, never cross each other physically, they're always in conversation and crossing and recrossing the same physical ground. And I think one of the ideas I had early on in the book was to write a novel about people who find themselves in a moment in which their freedom to tell the story of themselves is so constrained that they have no other option except to break that narrative in order to regain some sense of freedom, of possibility. And in the case of Epstein, he's further on in his life. He's 68 when we meet him. He is, as you described him, really a man who all his life was sure, was certain, had an abundance of authority, always knew exactly what to say, so he never had to be silent. There was a lack of silence in his life. And he also has enormous material wealth. So he is huge in his presence, both in that he captures the attention of a room, but he also has a lot, quite literally. And this question arises, what if I somehow was wrong? What if I didn't make room for uncertainty? What does it mean not to live a life without sufficient space for not knowing, for not being sure? And what do we lose when we insist on knowing, on being right, on being certain? And so it's in this moment that happens, a moment of kind of vulnerability after both of his parents die quite quickly, one after the other, and he leaves his wife of more than 30 years. This moment of questioning that happens to him where it begins with a lessening, a lightening of his material presence. He starts to give away everything he owns, and that culminates in a complete disappearance, right? But it also allows for, before that, this turning away from the material towards, I guess, what we can call the spiritual realm. And the spiritual realm being simply the place we go where we can contemplate the unknowable. And when we contemplate the unknowable, we have this opportunity to be filled with wonder and with awe. And so this book, in its search for how do we open ourselves to greater freedom, became also how do we open ourselves to sustaining uncertainty so that we have the benefits of that wonder and awe that we don't have when we just insist on knowing everything so certainly, as I think we do in this cultural moment we're in.
He spent his life arguing with people. And he's now lost, well, especially his parents, the three of them, they'd be like boxers, like sparring partners, continually, always arguing, always disagreeing. And now suddenly he has to learn how not to disagree with people, or how to be around people without violently disagreeing with them.
I think that his main way of being in the world was he defined himself by opposition. Do you all know people like that? Are you people like that? I think we all are to some degree. And part of becoming a person in the world is going through this period known as adolescence, which is to announce that you are opposite from what you came from. I am not that. I am not my parents. I am this new thing. And some of us go on with that strain for a long time in life. At some point, though, in the best instances, a shift happens in which you learn to listen, and also that one doesn't need to constantly define oneself. So in opposition and agreement, it kind of disappears a little bit. And I think he becomes, in this late moment of life, a person who poses questions. And to pose questions is very different than to offer answers. So he occupies this very different spiritual position. I should also say about Epstein, his story is constantly interspliced with the story of King David from the Bible. And that was a thought I had very early on. I didn't know very much about where I was going with this book, and I never do. But I did have this vision that somehow or other there was going to be this film of the life of King David that was going to be being made out in the Israeli desert, and it was going to somehow coincide with his narrative. And I had this thought, I had been thinking a lot about the story of David, which is really the first great and truly human character in the Bible. Truly human because unlike Abraham, unlike Moses, David is so fraught. He is, on the one hand, David, it means beloved. He is so beloved, so loved by so many. And he is also brutal, manipulative, a warrior, a killer, a lover. He's very, very, very human in his conflict. And at the same time, he is also, we ascribe to him some of the most beautiful poetry ever written, the Psalms. So he is this king warrior, but he is also this poet. And there's this moment early on in the novel where this rabbi comes up to Epstein. He's at this meeting at the Plaza Hotel between, Jewish American leadership and Palestinian leadership. And he's trying to get out of there, and this rabbi comes up to him and says, Epstein, that name goes all the way back to King David. And there are these names like Dayan, Abravanel, which supposedly can be traced back to the lineage of King David. And Epstein kind of laughs at that, but this idea begins to trickle into his thinking. And the thinking becomes, what if all your life you were all of those other things, beloved, but also brutal, manipulative, argumentative, larger than life? But what about this late turning towards the lyrical, the poetic, the spiritual? And so it's this other aspect of David, his namesake, his lineage, his whatever it is, that I think Epstein starts to become attuned to.
As part of this, we have here two New Yorkers, a Brooklynite, Manhattanite, do you say that? Epstein obviously lives in this amazing apartment in Manhattan, but they're both your protagonists. They're drawn to Israel, to Tel Aviv, and to the Hilton Hotel.
Yeah.
The Hilton Hotel is almost a character in this book. There are photographs in the book of the Hilton. Why the Hilton? Why? What was the magnetism of the Hilton?
The magnetism, where did it begin in my own life, or what is its role in the novel?
I'd like to know both,
slightly
actually.
different questions.
What's your story with the Hilton?
Well, so those of you who don't know the Hilton in Tel Aviv, we can maybe, if I can find them quickly, can see some pictures. So it's this enormous, is this visible to anyone? Yes. It's this enormous hotel that was built in the 60s, and it sits on the shore of Tel Aviv. It's kind of cantilevered out perpendicular to the sea. And it literally was built in the brutalist style. It's this massive, overwhelmingly ugly grid. Truly one of the most aggressive buildings you could imagine constructing, not at all inviting, what you would think a hotel should be. And it captures one's attention visibly, even from an airplane flying into Tel Aviv. It's so enormous, so insistent on itself. And it's a place that I had been going since I was a child, and my parents got married there. It's just a building that has lodged itself in my consciousness, and like the character in the book says, like a blockage that I couldn't kind of move around. And yet, like the writer in this book, so the other story is about, the parallel story to Epstein is about a writer. It is also a place where somewhat extraordinary things have happened to me. And so in this novel, it becomes, you think of architecture and the ways in which it insists on how we move through space, right? This building, for example, we all walked into this room as the architect of this building wanted us to walk, and with the experience that he or she, I doubt she, but he imagined. And this Hilton Hotel seems to insist on how you will move through space. And yet the author kind of turns that on its head in this book and says, well, this place to me when I was a child, became this kind of portal to otherworldliness, because such extraordinary things happened to me there that bent or tested how we think of reality. So maybe this is the moment we should read here, right? We talked about reading a short section about that. Okay, let me do that. Naturally, we didn't remember to mark the passage, so just give me one moment. Okay, I found it. Okay. So this is a section in which the writer, who is also named Nicole, is talking about why this hotel has meant so much to her. So she says, if the place has a kind of mystical aura for me, it isn't only because life began for me there, or that later I spent so many vacations at the hotel. It's also the spine-tingling nature of something that once happened to me there, an experience that only increased my awareness of an opening, a small tear in the fabric of reality. It occurred in the hotel swimming pool when I was 7. I spent a lot of time in that pool, which was set in a large terrace overlooking the sea and fed by its salt water. The year before, our visit had overlapped with Itzhak Perlman's, and one morning after breakfast, we came out and found him parked by the deep end, throwing a ball to his children, who took turns leaping into the pool, trying to catch it. The sight of the great violinist in his glinting wheelchair, along with a murky awareness that the polio that had crippled him had something to do with swimming pools, terrified me. The next day, I refused to go down to the pool altogether, and the day after that, we left Israel and flew back to New York. The following year, I returned to the hotel with a feeling of unease, but Perlman didn't reappear. Furthermore, on the first day back, my brother and I discovered that the pool was full of money. Shekels everywhere, shimmering mutely on the floor of the pool as if the drain were hooked up to Bank Ha'Poalim. Whatever lingering fears I had about swimming were shunted aside by the steady flow of cash we could turn up. As in any well-run operation, we soon divided and specialized. My brother, 2 years older, became the diver, and I, with smaller lung capacity and keener eyes, became the spotter. At my direction, he would plunge down and grope around at the blurry bottom. If he had been right, which he was about 65% of the time, if I had been right, which I was about 65% of the time, he would burst excitedly to the surface, clutching the coin. One afternoon, after a string of false calls, I began to feel desperate. The day was wearing on, and our time in the pool was almost up. My brother was wading morosely along the wall of the shallow end. I couldn't help myself, and from the middle of the pool shouted, "There!" I was lying. I'd seen nothing. But I couldn't resist the chance to make my brother happy again. He came splashing toward me. "Right there!" I yelled. He went below. I knew there was nothing at the bottom, and now, treading water at the top, I waited miserably for my brother to find out too. The crushing guilt I felt in those few moments comes vividly back even more than 30 years later. It was one thing to lie to my parents, but to so blatantly betray my brother was something else again. As for what happened next, I have no explanation for it, or none beyond the possibility that the laws we cling to in order to assure ourselves that all is as it seems have occluded a more complex view of the universe, one that forgoes the comfort of squeezing the world to fit the limited reach of our comprehension. Otherwise, how else to explain that when my brother surfaced and uncurled his fingers, lying in his palm was an earring with 3 diamonds, and beneath them, hanging from a gold loop at the bottom, a ruby heart. In dripping bathing suits, we followed our mother through the frigid, air-conditioned hallways of the hotel to the H. Stearns in the lobby. She explained the situation to the balding jeweler, who looked at us dubiously as he pushed a tray lined with blue velvet across the glass countertop. My mother laid the earring down, and the jeweler fit the loop to his eye. He studied our treasure. When he lifted his head at last, his giant, magnified eye swiveled over us. "Real," he pronounced. "The gold is 18 karat. Real. The word catches in the throat and won't go down. It never occurred to me then that the earring might be fake in the way that my mother had suspected it was. And yet only I knew just how unreal it really was, how against the odds was my brother's discovery of it, how it had materialized in answer to a need. No young child naturally believes that reality is firm. To her, its springs are loose. It is open to her special pleading. But slowly she is taught to believe otherwise, and by then I was 7, old enough to have mostly come around to accepting that reality was fixed and utterly indifferent to my longings. Now, at the last minute, a foot was put in the way of a door closing.
So out of the unreal comes the real. Nicole in the book is an author. She, at one point, I think she says she hates Descartes, and that we've become sick with knowledge. We've kind of stuffed ourselves with knowledge. And the book very much seems to be searching for something beyond what we know, beyond what science can tell us. And it's a search for those other worlds that if you dive in, even though things may not, according to science, be there, they can still be there.
I would put it a little differently, which is that if we actually, all of us, listened to what science was telling us, we would understand how radically unlike reality really is. Which is to say that scientists who study anything, for example, the notions of consciousness, there are scientists who will talk with incredible eloquence about the idea of panpsychism, that all material things have consciousness. There's so many branches of science that will tell us things about our world, even the most simple things. For example, we all studied physics, right? And yet in our physics classes when we were 12 or 13 or 14, we learned that like this is not solid. And yet we all continue to agree that everything around us is solid, even though we know it's just atoms in a void, because we need a certain version of agreed upon reality so that we can survive in it. Or other ways of thinking about our like collectively agreed upon fictional reality would be like that the money in your wallet is worth something, right? Like it's just paper. We just decided on this fiction. And there's so many ways in which once we start to step back and say, actually reality as we agree to live it is also a narrative, just like the self is a narrative. And this novel is about questioning that narrative and questioning to begin with the narrative of self, which starts before we can tell it. We're not the first authors of that narrative of self. Of course, our parents are, for example, you were like this, you were the irreverent, mischievous one, and your sister was the good one. She was such a good student, and she was, this story that begins from this, and then for the rest of your life, you are the irreverent one, because that is the story that began to be told about you, and you build on it, but to some degree or other, you need it to live. If you read scientists who talk about the brain, very quickly, it emerges that we do not have any access to historical truth. Our memories do not have the capacity to accurately remember the past. We only have narrative truth, which is to say the brain transforms experience into narrative. And we need that sense of a coherent narrative more than we need an accurate account of reality or our lives, which is why we discount so many things and continue to tell ourselves sort of fictions, narratives. So this book is sort of, on many levels, asking the question of, okay, we know this about ourselves, we know about the primacy of narrative in our lives, but why don't we allow, if that's the case, why don't we allow ourselves more capaciousness in the stories we tell? Why don't we allow ourselves the opportunity to sometimes break those narratives when they become too limiting, too constrained, or when they no longer fit us? And we meet both of these characters, Nicole, the writer, and Epstein, in a moment when their narratives have broken down and the forms they have chosen no longer fit them. It is a terrifying moment too, because at that moment, you have to, if you're going to leap out of the form you've chosen, wife, husband, authority on the world, whatever it is, you have to then allow for formlessness, the formlessness that follows before you find a better shaped form, a wider narrative. And so we meet them in that kind of moment of contemplating that.
Yeah, Nicole's narrative that she's kind of leaving behind is her life as, well, the wife of somebody, basically. So that she comes to Israel looking for, shapelessness, new forms. What she finds, partly what's given to her through coincidence or, well, at least a few, events that can't be told, is a story that somebody wants her to tell. And this is where the book, I guess, refuses to bow to, how history has been told, the established narrative. The established narrative in this case is about Franz Kafka.
Yeah.
And this is...
Yeah, Kafka is kind of he surprised me by becoming a kind of ghostly third character in all of this. And so Nicole is kind of accosted, maybe too strong a word, but certainly pursued by a man who may or may not have been former Mossad, may or may not have been a retired professor of literature of Tel Aviv University. It's never quite clear.
His narrative is a bit unstable, isn't it?
And Friedman welcomes the instability of narrative. But he gets in touch with her because he's read her books, and he kind of thinks that, suffice to say, something like this actually happened to me once. And he has this idea that she can somehow be useful in the telling of the Jewish story, something which she, and I doubt any writer, wants to be useful in. Writers want to be independent. They want to write their own stories, and then their work is used as it may be.
Can Jewish writers be completely free, though, of the fact that they are Jewish writers?
Can we return to that in a moment? I promise I'll get to it. But let me just finish this one thought, because that's a very big question. But she is basically, he walks her to this place on Spinoza Street in Tel Aviv where, and this is true, for years and years and years, all of the remaining unpublished papers of Franz Kafka were sitting under the neglectful ownership of a woman who inherited them from her mother, who had been the secretary of Max Brod being the one who, of course, salvaged all of Kafka's works, edited it, published it. So these papers were there, and they were an 8-year-long court case in Israel about who has the right to own these things. Can they be owned privately? Do they belong to the National Library of Israel, and so on? So he brings her there, and he tells her basically this is a project, and he wants to kind of assign her a writing role in this, and her kind of journey through Israel and to the desert begins there. But at some point when I was writing this, it dawned on me that Kafka's narrative, the narrative we all tell ourselves about who he was entirely written by another man. It was entirely written by Max Brod, who wrote the first and, the only biography of which is the first-person account of him, who decided what to publish, when to publish it, who edited all of his writings, who told us who this man was. And so much of our notion of what is Kafkaesque comes from a vision of him. And that vision is of a man who kind of never escaped, who wasn't made for life, who was incredibly sickly and weak, and who never escaped the need to work in his father's, in the accident insurance agency, never escaped his overbearing father, never escaped all of the restrictions that didn't allow him to be the writer he wanted to be. And yet when you read Kafka, there's a sense of somebody who, escaped everything in a way, and in part because we're still reading him all these years later. And it dawned on me that there's possibly another story to tell about Kafka, and so that began to get written in this book. And I think it got written in a way that turned out to be so convincing that many people then Googled, did Franz Kafka really die in 1924 in Prague? Because in Forest Dark, he doesn't die then, and he has this afterlife. He's secreted out, and he has this afterlife in Palestine than Israel.
Yeah. Do you want to get back
to
the
back
other
to the Jewish question? So the question was...
Friedman's idea, this perhaps Mossad agent's idea, is that thinking that, well, Nicole's idea of being free to write whatever she wants to is naive.
I think her point, and I would stand by this point, is that a writer is not responsible to anything. If she is responsible to anything, it limits her freedom, which limits her ability to write with honesty and authenticity. And therefore, she cannot write for anyone, she cannot represent anyone except for her version of the truth. How writing gets used is not up to her. How her books get used, thought about, is simply not up to the writer. Books are gifts. They are given. Once they're given, they can't be taken back. And the book becomes as much the reader's as it ever was the writer's. And that's a contract you enter into both as reader and as writer, and celebrate. I celebrate that contract. This book is no longer mine in that sense. It bears now all of the accumulated readings and memories and thoughts and ideas and arguments of the readers who come to it. So in that sense, it may very well become a Jewish book or not a Jewish book if it's read in... Somebody just sent me images from Instagram of one of my books translated into Farsi in Iran. Iran doesn't follow the Geneva Convention, so they don't actually have to ask for the right to translate it. But I don't care. I think that is amazing. I thought it was amazing to see this book translated into that language and belonging to those readers there, of all places. And it becomes whatever it will. But in my feeling about Jewishness, it's a rich subject that I will always want to engage with, but I also will always be free to say what I want about it and to move away from it and return to it.
Books, as you said, books play, they play an important role in almost everything you've written. In some ways you can say, well, the Bible as a book is very important here, but also Epstein's transformation, it somehow begins with a small book of poetry that he has given. I was quite interested, why you chose this kind of, very often books kind of reverse things, books.
I'm not conscious of the choice, but now that you say it, I think, yeah, it's obviously true. I think, to return to the question of Jewishness, I am educated in the notion that writing is not self-expression, but self-creation, that books and texts are the place where we create ourselves. And so they have this incredibly powerful capacity in our lives, right? They're not just documents that reflect who we are. They are, to write and to read is to decide who we are, who we want to become. And that's just a powerful thing that I think I will always return to. It certainly is a kind of heat under which my dedication to writing kind of burns.
Did you grow up with a lot of books?
By choice, yes. I mean, I was a reader from a very, very early age, and it was a situation of discovering that reading was a way to travel beyond the constraints of my young life, and so I could leave it like that, and go anywhere. And I think I experienced, because nobody really told me what to read and nobody monitored what I read, I could read things that I'm sure were entirely inappropriate for a young person to read, but it also gave me a view on how large and complex and many-faceted the world is, life is, people are, the ways in which people cannot be reduced, that, to meet characters in books that have the capacity for incredible generosity and kindness and enormous violence, for example, to begin to understand at a young age just how complex a person can be, was a huge, huge gift to me, and I think and a saving grace for me. And thinking I knew I didn't want to leave that world, which is why I just did everything I could to stay in it, and became a writer.
Are you worried about the state of books? I can be, about young people not really reading books, about books not playing the role in our lives that they used to.
Yeah, we were discussing this a little bit before. I mean, and I was discussing it with my wonderful publisher Dorothea on the way over here tonight. I think it's undeniable that it's happening. And there's, you were raising this question when we were speaking together about when we lose this capacity for deep reading. So, of course, there's been a lot of studies done on this, and we know that when we read online, we read very, very quickly, so our brains are gaining enormous speed, but we are learning to cherry pick for information, and we read kind of like in an F pattern online, so we read a long line, then we graze down the page, we read a shorter line across, and then we go down. So we learn to skim and find the bits and pieces that we need to put together. But this is putting aside the fact that when we're reading online, we're usually reading from places and that more or less subscribes to the same opinion that we already have, et cetera, et cetera. But okay, just put that aside to talk about the idea of deep reading. When we read books, we're reading on a very, very different level. And when we are empathizing with characters, we're able to make these very, very subtle connections that happen in metaphor, in character. And we're all kinds of qualities in our personhood are being developed, our empathy, I said already. And I think that it's the worry about losing that a lot of us have. My feeling is that I already see in younger people a kind of enormous frustration in the ways in which technology is really impoverishing their lives, our lives, and is really robbing us of our silence, our freedom, our time, and the ways in which more and more we are also serving technology, also serving corporate interests, and how much we give of our time to other people's who profit from that, while our lives become lessened by it. And I see that, and I think that something will change. And if that change happens, to read a book is the most revolutionary thing. It is, as you said, we were talking before, it becomes an act of resistance, because to read a book is to stand alone in silence and to think, and to be free to think whatever you want. And to read a book is not to watch a television show which had to be green-lighted by 1 million people, behind which there's lots of money, interest, and we're talking about soundtracks and the way that they manipulate our emotions. And no matter how good a TV show is, it is never as powerful, as revolutionary, as awesome as a single mind that sits alone in a room thinking for years and then gives this gift of a book for another person to sit alone and think and feel. And so the hope is that people will return to that, will feel the absence of that. Fingers crossed.
Yeah, let's hope so.
Yeah.
Let's return to Nicole and Jules Epstein. I don't know, she's first name, he's last name.
Yeah, well, his first name is there, and it was there for me from the beginning because his name is Jules, and I had this image. I told you that I had this image of the film about King David in the desert, and the book opens with Epstein's disappearance in the desert. So we know from the beginning he's disappeared. And I had this image of people in the calling for him in the desert and calling his name, Jules, Jules, and then it bounces off the hills and it comes back as Jews, Jews, Jews. His name was important, but it's funny about names, like how you choose them and why. It's almost like it's like with my son when he plays baseball. You have to get the mitt. The mitt has to feel right in your hand, whatever it is. Like you need a name that feels right in your hand, in your mouth when you use it. And there isn't a lot of logic to it until later people point out to you all the endless logic in your choosing. I remember when in The History of Love, there's a character called Alma Singer, and I had chose Alma because I love the name, and Singer in the last name of the boyfriend I had when I was 14, which is how old she is. And then someone said, well, of course, Alma Singer was Isaac Bashevis Singer's wife, and so you chose that because, and I thought, oh, not really. So.
This time, though, you chose your own name.
Yes, I did. And I think I had a very specific idea behind that, some of which I've touched on already. But my idea was, if I'm asking the reader to engage in a conversation with me about why we allow for narrative to narrow us rather than expand us, and why is it that we know we can do something else because it happens when we read and it happens when we write, where we become much more expansive, right? In the story we tell, we allow characters and we allow all kinds of other narratives to expand our own. Why do we drop that when we leave the book or leave our writing table and go back out into the world? So I thought, if I'm going to ask the reader that question, in a sense, perhaps it's only fair to use myself as a guinea pig. So let's say, for example, I take myself, or I take someone who looks like me with some of the characteristics that I have. I don't need a lot. She's a writer, she lives in Brooklyn, she has 2 children, she's at the end of a marriage that no longer fits her. And let's name her Nicole, too. And her name only comes up once. You can miss it, but nobody seems to miss it somehow. And I'll tell you something about that in a second, too. But then, let's take her and let's begin to put her through the paces of fiction, which is what we do when we read, when we write, but it's also what we do when we tell the story of ourselves, when we remember. So let's begin to put her into this creative process, and let's see what happens to her. So does her freedom expand or shrink? Is it terrifying or is it liberating? Do her possibilities expand or diminish? What will happen to her when we break this narrative in quite a violent way, in a sense? And putting her through the paces of literature means sending her out into a story that couldn't possibly be true. And that's we started to allude to that with Kafka. And it's funny because I am so often asked, well, this is about you, is this autobiographical? And I always think, not unless Kafka didn't die in 1924, it's not. But in a sense, the limits of autobiography only reach so far. And it certainly, autobiography wasn't my interest here. My interest was, let me use myself to have this conversation about the self, the narrative of self.
Unlike most authors, I mean, very early on, you became a public person, a famous person. Was it also a way of kind of dragging back in, taking back the story? Because I guess fame is really having your narrative taken away from you, having your story told by other people.
If you allow yourself to be aware of that, it is. I don't allow myself to be particularly aware of that. I don't have any social media, which means I don't ever go on social media, so I don't really know a lot of what's said, and that's probably a blessing. I'm sure it's a blessing. No, it didn't feel like that, I must say. I never had that idea that I wanted to take back my story, because I never felt like my story was taken from me. On the contrary, it seems to me there are so many people in the world who don't get to have a voice, and I do, and I have amazing luck to be able to be listened to and heard and translated into so many languages. So it's that I don't forget, and more than being worried about what other people have to say about my life. But I think it has more to do with the fact, maybe it speaks to this question that you raised about, technology and what people not reading. I do think that there is a crisis of literature now, and in some ways, maybe this book is, and many other books like Knausgaard's books or Rachel Cusk's books, or many people who are who are writing what is now seen to be called autofiction. But the crisis being, if the primary role of the novel used to be narrative, and that role is now being taken up, it seems very well, by television, by film, by Twitter, or Instagram, or all of these places that are engaged with narrative. And also, if everybody has a narrative voice now who wants one, and I would count Instagram as having a narrative voice, right? So 15 years ago, far few people had a narrative voice. Now anyone can have one. So if that has been taken away from the novel as its primary or unique ability, what does the novel have? What can the novel offer that is unique only to it? And the first thought is, well, it allows us something that I have never found anywhere else, which is the opportunity to so fully and completely inhabit another person, that we feel we are them, we feel we are him or her for the duration of that novel. It is to be inside somebody, to feel another's consciousness welded with our own, because of course it's our own memories, our own feelings, which are furnishing that character and that life. But it's an absolutely extraordinary feeling, that moment when we, however you want to call it, fall in love with a character, feel we're a character, are moved by a character. And I don't think it happens in the same way in film or television, where you are always passively on the outside. You are never fully embodied within that mind or body feeling life. So I think that there are these things that literature can still do that nothing else can, but I think the novel is kind of scrabbling around for the answer to that. And one of the things it's tried to do is to say, okay, it's true that now all of us are telling our stories infinitely, endlessly, 24 hours round the clock in the digital world. But isn't there a way in which, when we're consciously doing that, or we're doing that with a certain kind of skill or training or imagination, that we're doing it in such a way that unites us more powerfully or moves us more powerfully, whatever it is? And I think maybe that's some of what you see in these novels that are shifting away from traditional narrative toward using the self as subject.
What autofiction does, and what I think is also amazing with Nicole in the book, is that it's very insightful. She does know a lot about herself. She's spent a lot of time, introspective time, thinking about who she is, what she should be doing, just what her identity is. And yet, which is, I guess, the beauty of it, she's just as lost as everyone else. And I guess that's the pull of autofiction, isn't it? Even Knausgaard, he can spend 5 volumes writing thousands of pages trying to understand the self, trying to understand humanity. And we learn with you when we read, but we kind of end up just as lost.
I hope not, because I think when I read Knausgaard, I'm aware of something else, which is somebody who has time enough not to let time pass so quickly that his life passes without trying to make idea or sense out of it. And so he gives us the vast stuff of life with all of its endless banality and detail, and he tries to make pattern out of it. And I think it's that's the pattern which we need and we're drawn to, and we're ultimately satisfied by in ways that we're not satisfied by the ongoing chaos of the unmeditated life, the unthought about life, in which we're mostly living when we're not reading or otherwise. And I think the question of being lost. I don't feel like I dropped the book in a moment where Nicole is more lost than she was. I think she's delivered to a moment of really radical change. Her life can never be the same again. And in a sense, it doesn't matter what that change will be. But it's about this cognizant, meditative, staying there for the moment and contemplating it. Here I am about to change everything, and what does that mean? And so often in life we don't have a chance to do that. The hope is that the reader also has a chance to sit and think about those things, to contemplate those things, because outside of the book, divorce happens to us, our parents die, our children are born, and there isn't often time to make pattern out of it, to make meaning out of it, and that is our human need.
Is that why you write? To make pattern?
I wouldn't reduce it only to that. I can think of a long list of the many reasons why I write, and first and foremost would be to claim my freedom as an individual in the world, to claim my freedom to tell a larger story and to not be constrained to travel to other worlds, to create new worlds. But I like making patterns, and I like breaking them too.
Yes. Into shapelessness.
Not forever. There's this moment in the book where Nicole is talking about how there's this pattern in nature, right, where we watch it every year of things that are born and form, and then leaves that fall and decompose, and this destruction, this creation, destruction that happens around us all the time. And yet we're so terrified as human beings of destruction or of formlessness. We're so frightened of it that we just cling to our stability, even when it doesn't suit us any longer. And I think, again, I'm not interested in just the shapelessness or the formlessness if it isn't for the sake of finding a better, newer shape or form that fits us better, that will last for a while before we go through that cycle again.
Why do we hold on so much to what we've been, I think?
Why do we hold on to what we've been?
The narrative that we've already told about ourselves. Why does Nicole? Why is she so scared? Well, at the beginning, at least.
I feel like I've spoken to that a little bit, but I think I remember having this conversation with my son on the walk to school one day, and he used to, for years, my younger son wanted to be an adventurer. That was what he wanted to grow up to be, as an adventurer. And he said, why doesn't everyone just want to be an adventurer? Like, what, And I said, well, everyone falls on this spectrum between needing stability and needing change. We're all somewhere, and at different times we're on that. But a lot of us really need stability. A lot of people really need stability. And there are some of us who really love change. And it just depends where we are. And I think stability allows for our survival. Even if it's not great, we know that we can manage it, and we sort of stay with it. And there's a comfort to the old stories we tell about ourselves. It's enormous comfort. And to some degree, we have no choice. As I said, our brains function that way. Our human brains work that way. At the same time, we are the only species that seeks to change, that seeks to grow, is cognizant of the power of change, of changing ourselves. And so we also know how powerful it can be, how beautiful, how much it's our goal, ultimately, to evolve. only we know that. It's an enormous burden. Only we are aware of our evolving in a way that other animals aren't. And so we also aim ourselves toward it. But where we are on that spectrum at any given moment, whether we're going to be adventurers or not, is different at different moments in our lives.
It's also in the book an important, step on the way, and I guess which is very much connected to, this idea of what are we as humans. Nicole sees herself from the outside. She has experiences where she's in her life. She also sees her life as somebody else. This is also connected to the Bible, to the story of Abraham, isn't it? There's a reading of the Bible here, both when it comes to the story of David and to the story of Abraham, where it really is taken into the everyday life of today.
Right.
How can we relate to this in the 2010s?
You're talking about Lech Lecha.
And she her interpretation of what Abraham does when he leaves.
Yes.
Is quite different to perhaps the set narrative for that.
Yeah. It's interesting because I think this idea of being, it opens with this moment in which she doesn't so much see herself now, she feels she is somewhere else in the house. She comes home and she has this uncanny sensation that she's already there, somewhere upstairs in the house. Then she talks about this feeling that she's had since she was young, and she talks about her first memory, which is my first memory, which is of being like 2 and watching TV. And it's a children's show, so there's a studio audience of other children, and I, in this case, saw myself. Absolutely sure that I saw myself. It was absolutely me, wearing the sneakers that I had and then the hair that I had. And I've thought about this for years and years and years, that this is the memory on which all of my other memories are built. This thing that I am here and there. And I can analyze it endlessly, but in the most simplistic sense, I do think that my life has never been in one place. And there's always been, because of family, grandparents that were born in 4 different European countries, had to leave them all, parents that were born in 2 different countries. There's this endlessly bifurcating narratives of place and self. The story of where I could have lived and how easily I could have been European or Israeli or whatever it is has always been present in my life. And what would have happened if this one didn't survive, if that one didn't get out, if this one didn't meet, if they didn't get introduced in Jerusalem, so that, which I guess to some degree we all have. You could have turned right and you wouldn't have met the woman you fell in love with and had the children you have, or you could have turned left and you would have been, I don't know, mowed down by that bicycle, but you didn't. You mowed down by that truck, whatever, you turned right. And you lived. But these endless, as we get older, these endless reverberations of these other narratives of who we could have been kind of still live with us a little bit, or I'm particularly sensitive to them, maybe because my job is to keep them alive.
Right, those.
Yeah. So I think in a sense, that sense of elsewhere, of being here and there, and that being fundamental is something about being a writer too,
I think our time is up, actually. We did get to something fundamental about being a writer, not all of
so.
it. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank
so much,
you.
Nicole.
Thank you. Oh, thank you.